I didn't cry. I didn't pack a bag and drive to her house and bang on the door the way every part of me wanted to. I just sat at my kitchen table in Vancouver with a cold cup of coffee and typed back 2 words. That's fine. Because I already knew what she didn't. Let me back up. I'm the kind of person who makes lists. Grocery lists, savings lists, 5-year plans and spreadsheets with color-coded tabs. My brother used to tease me about it when we were kids. He'd find my notebooks and flip through them laughing. You're 30 years old, living in a 14-year-old's planner, he'd say. I didn't argue. The lists kept me sane. The lists kept me moving forward when everything around me was designed to pull me backward. I grew up in a house where money was always tight, but somehow never tight enough to stop my parents from spoiling my younger sister. She's 3 years younger than me, and from the time she was old enough to want things, she got them. Not because my parents were cruel people. They weren't. They were just the kind of people who found it easier to say yes to her than to deal with the aftermath of saying no. And the aftermath was always spectacular. The tears, the sulking, the way she could make an entire room feel guilty for her disappointment. It was a skill. I say that without malice. It genuinely was. I learned early that I was the other kind of kid. The one who figured things out. The one the teachers called self-sufficient. Which sounds like a compliment, until you realize it means nobody's checking to make sure you're okay. I got a part-time job at 16. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I got into a landscape architecture program at UBC and paid my own way through it. Student loans, yes, but also 3 jobs in my second year, which I don't recommend to anyone. By the time I was 28, I had a job I loved at a mid-sized firm in Vancouver, a small savings account I'd built up carefully over 4 years, and a dream I'd been quietly feeding for just as long, my own urban garden studio. A space where I'd design small-scale gardens for city homes, balconies, rooftops, shared courtyards, custom planters, native plants, consultation and installation. There was nothing quite like it in the East Side neighborhood I had in mind. I'd done the market research. I'd talked to potential clients. I had a waiting list before I had a storefront. The space I found was a former print shop on a corner in East Van. Heritage-designated brick exterior, enormous windows that faced north and east, perfect growing light for the plants I'd keep on display. The owner was an older man who'd been trying to sell for 2 years. We negotiated something reasonable. I used my savings for the down payment, got a small business loan through BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, and my bank approved the rest. I had a lawyer review everything. I had a contractor lined up who specialized in heritage buildings, because I knew you couldn't just swing a hammer in a place like that without permits and structural sign-off. The City of Vancouver's Heritage Office had specific requirements, and I met every single one of them. I spent 6 months doing it properly. 6 months of permits and inspections and back and forth with the city and meetings with my contractor and late nights drawing up plans for the interior layout. I wasn't cutting corners. I'd seen what happened when people cut corners on buildings like mine, and I wasn't going to be that story. My parents knew about the studio. I'd told them about it the previous Christmas, over dinner at their house in Burnaby. My mother had nodded in that way she has, where she's present in body only. My father said, "That sounds like a lot of risk." My sister had looked up from her phone long enough to say, "What's the markup on plants?" She wasn't asking because she was curious about my business model. She was, I understand now, filing away information. At the time I let it go. She'd always had a passing interest in aesthetics. She took an online course in event decor once, and for about 8 months she talked about starting a floral arrangement business. Nothing ever came of it. With her, things rarely did. She'd get excited about something, spend money on it, get bored, move on. My parents bankrolled most of it. I'd stopped counting. My studio was scheduled to open in early spring. I had everything in place, the permits, the fit-out, the plant suppliers, a part-time employee named Ren who'd been working in horticulture for 7 years and was exactly the kind of person I wanted representing the space. I built a social media following. I had a feature lined up in a local lifestyle magazine. I was, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely excited about something that was entirely mine. Then my sister called. It was a Tuesday evening. I was at the studio going over the final inspection checklist with my contractor when my phone buzzed. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Then a third time. I stepped outside. "I need to talk to you about the shop," she said. "I need to talk to you about the shop," she said. I remember noticing that she called it the shop. Not your shop. Just the shop, like it was a neutral object, sitting in the world unattached to anyone. What about it? I said. I've been thinking, she said, and I really think the space would be perfect for my floral studio. The light is amazing, the location is great, the heritage aesthetic is exactly the brand I'm going for. I've already talked to Mom and Dad, and they think it makes more sense for me to use it. You could consult from home, honestly. You don't really need a physical space. I stood on the sidewalk outside my building. The building I had spent 6 months and a significant portion of my savings preparing, and I felt something very cold and very still settle in my chest. It's my building, I said. I bought it. My name is on the title. I know, she said, breezily, like this was a small administrative detail. But you'd sign it over. We'd make it work. Mom and Dad can help cover what you've put in so far, some of it anyway, and then you'd be free to start over somewhere smaller. The space is too big for plants, honestly. You're not thinking commercially. I asked her if she was serious. She said she was. She said she'd already started sourcing inventory. She said she'd been telling people about it. I said, I'm not signing anything, and I went back inside. That night I called my lawyer. Here's what I want to say about the next 2 weeks, because I think it matters. I didn't tell her what I was doing. I didn't warn her. I didn't send a long emotional message laying out my grievances, which is what I would have done 5 years ago. I was 31 years old, and I had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that arguing with my sister was like arguing with weather. You could be completely right and it didn't matter. The cloud didn't care. So instead of arguing, I documented. I took screenshots of every message she sent me about the building, and there were many. She was not subtle. She texted me floor plan ideas. She sent me a logo she'd designed for Blossom & Co. She told me she'd already reached out to a supplier in the Fraser Valley. She even, and I want to be clear that I am not embellishing, sent me a draft Instagram caption for her grand opening, which she had scheduled for a date 3 weeks after my own planned opening. My lawyer read through everything and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she hasn't actually done anything actionable yet, but if she tries to enter the property without your permission, we move immediately. I said, she will. My lawyer said, then we'll be ready. 2 days later, my mother called. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and I will summarize it. My sister had a vision. My sister had passion. My sister had been through a hard year. My parents were not in a financial position to help her the way they used to be, and this opportunity felt like something they could give her. Didn't I have my career? Didn't I have my savings? Couldn't I be flexible? I said, the building is mine. I'm not transferring it. My mother said I was being selfish. I said, I'll talk to you soon, and I got off the phone. The week before my opening, I flew to Toronto for a supplier conference I'd already had registered for months. I was gone for 5 days. I told exactly one person, Ren, where I was and what I expected to happen while I was away. Ren had a key. Ren also had my lawyer's number and mine and knew to call the moment anything unusual happened. On day 3 of the conference, Ren called me. My sister had arrived at the building with my father and a man they'd apparently hired, carrying a pry bar and a circular saw. She'd told my father the transfer had already gone through, and she just needed to start the demo. My father, who I do not believe is a bad man, but who has never in his life questioned a single thing my sister has told him, helped her force the side door. Ren had stepped outside the moment they arrived. Ren did not argue with them. Ren walked to the coffee shop across the street and called me, then called my lawyer, then sat down with a flat white and her phone and recorded everything from the window. I watched the video that night in my Toronto hotel room. My sister was pulling up the flooring I'd had installed. She'd taken down the shelving units along the east wall. My father was helping her move equipment into the alley. The man they brought had started on the wall between the main room and the back workroom, not a partition wall as it turned out, but a wall my contractor had specifically told me not to touch because of how it connected to the original load-bearing brick structure. There was a heritage designation on that wall. There was a city permit process that had to be followed before anything could be altered. None of that had happened. I sat in Toronto and I watched, and I did not call her. I called my lawyer instead. By morning, there was a stop work order filed with the city of Vancouver. By the following afternoon, a heritage compliance officer had been notified. By the time I landed back at YVR, my lawyer had documentation of the unauthorized entry, the unlicensed demolition work, and the structural interference with a designated heritage element, which in Vancouver carry significant legal weight and can result in mandatory restoration orders. substantial fines, and in some cases personal liability for whoever directed the work. My sister did not know any of this. She was, from what Ren told me, in very good spirits. She'd posted to Instagram. She'd invited people to a soft opening. She'd had someone paint Blossom & Co. in gold lettering on the front window over my business name, which she'd apparently scraped off with a razor blade. I want to tell you about the moment she found out, because it happened in front of an audience and I was not there for it, which is maybe the thing I'm most grateful for in this entire story. She'd set up her soft opening for a Saturday afternoon. She'd invited friends, a few local vendors, someone from a neighborhood blog. She was doing a live video on Instagram when the city inspector arrived, not because I'd called that morning, but because the stop work order had triggered a mandatory on-site inspection and the timing, purely by bureaucratic coincidence, landed on her soft opening Saturday. Ren was across the street again. She sent me the clip later. The inspector asked who had authorized the structural work on the east interior wall. My sister said she owned the building. The inspector asked for documentation. My sister produced nothing because there was nothing to produce. The inspector asked everyone to leave the premises. My sister pointed at the camera she was live streaming to and said, and Ren, transcribe this for me verbatim. This woman is harassing me. Someone call the police. This is my business. The inspector was not a woman, for what it's worth. The soft opening ended. The live stream ended. The inspector posted the stop work order on the front door and left. By the following week, the city had assessed the unauthorized demolition damage. Because the wall my sister's hired man had worked on was part of a heritage-designated structure, the restoration requirements were not minor. Heritage restoration in Vancouver, especially for Class B and Class C heritage buildings, which mine was, involves licensed contractors, city-approved materials, and in some cases, specialist consultants. The estimate that came back for restoring what had been damaged was $34,000. My sister did not have $34,000. My parents, who had been so certain this was all going to resolve simply, co-signed on an emergency line of credit to cover part of it. This meant using their home equity, their house in Burnaby, which they own, and which they had been intending to leave to both of us eventually. I did not engineer this. I want to be clear about that. I did not set out to put my parents in financial difficulty. I set out to protect what I had built. The consequences cascaded the way they did, because my sister acted as though ownership and legality were inconveniences that didn't apply to her, and my parents, for the thousandth time, decided to back her up without asking a single question. Ren got a permanent position and a raise when the studio finally opened, 6 weeks late after the restoration was completed, paid for by my sister and, in part, by my parents' equity line. The delay cost me the magazine feature, which was disappointing. But the studio opened, and Ren had managed to keep our plant inventory alive through all of it, which felt like a minor miracle and also like a metaphor I am too tired to fully articulate. The first week we were open, a woman came in and spent $2,200 on a full balcony garden design and installation. She told me she'd been following our Instagram since before we opened and had been waiting. I thanked her, and then I went into the back room and stood quietly for about 2 minutes because I didn't trust myself not to cry on a client. My sister hasn't spoken to me since the inspector showed up. My mother called once, about a month later, to tell me she thought I'd handled things coldly. I said I thought I'd handled things legally and carefully, which was the only way I knew how to handle things. She said that wasn't what she meant. I said I knew what she meant, and that I was sorry the situation had been hard on them, and that I hoped we could find a way to have a relationship again eventually, but that I wasn't going to apologize for keeping what was mine. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were always so stubborn." I said, "I know. It's the thing that saved me." I don't know if she understood what I meant. I don't know if she'll ever ask. But I meant every word of it, because the same quality that made me the daughter who kept lists, who filed her own taxes at 19, who read every line of a commercial lease agreement before she signed it, who called a lawyer before she called her mother when things went sideways, that quality is the reason I'm standing in a studio with good north-facing light, surrounded by plants that survived a very bad month, talking to clients who waited for me. My sister had passion, my mother told me. My sister had vision, maybe, but I had a paper trail, and in the end, that was the thing that mattered. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in this story. Not the legal part, not the inspection, not the $34,000 restoration bill, but the part underneath all of that. The part that's harder to put words to. My sister didn't wake up one morning and decide to be a villain. I genuinely don't believe that. What she did was follow a pattern that always worked for her. She wanted something. She declared she wanted it. The people around her rearranged themselves to make it happen, and life moved on. That pattern had been rewarded so consistently for so many years that I think she'd stopped being able to see it as a pattern at all. It just felt like how things worked. You want something, you reach for it. Someone hands it to you. The problem is that the world outside your family doesn't run on that logic. Permit offices don't. Heritage compliance officers don't. And a sister who spent 15 years learning to read the fine print and file her own paperwork, she doesn't either, not anymore. What I keep coming back to is this. The consequences my sister faced weren't something I did to her. They were the natural end of a very long chain of choices she made freely, one after another, in broad daylight. She chose to enter a building that wasn't hers. She chose to hire someone to tear into a wall she had no authority to touch. She chose to live stream her soft opening before she'd asked a single legal question about whether she was allowed to be there at all. Every step she took was her own step. I just stopped stepping out of the way. There's something I've been trying to articulate about Ren sitting in that coffee shop across the street with her phone, recording everything quietly. She didn't intervene. She didn't confront. She just witnessed. And in the end, that witnessing was worth more than any argument I could have had with my sister on the phone. It was worth more than any angry text I could have sent. Documentation is not a dramatic act. It doesn't feel satisfying in the moment. But it is the most honest thing you can do. It says, simply, this happened and I can prove it. I think about the version of me from 10 years ago who would have driven to that building and screamed, who would have called my parents crying, who would have spent weeks trying to make everyone understand how unfair it was. That version of me would have been right about the unfairness and wrong about the strategy, and she would have walked away from the whole mess exhausted and empty-handed. The version of me who sat in a Toronto hotel room watching a video of her sister pull up her floors and said nothing and called her lawyer. That version of me has a studio, she has a client base, she has north-facing windows full of plants that survived a month they weren't supposed to survive. Resilience isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the last person still standing in the room, quietly, with your paperwork in order. That's the only thing I know for certain, looking back at all of it. The people who take shortcuts, in ethics, in legality, in basic human decency toward the people who love them, they don't usually face immediate consequences. Sometimes they go years without any. But the shortcuts accumulate. The corners cut stack up. And one day they arrive at a soft opening with a circular saw and no permits, and they find out that reality kept a record even when they weren't paying attention. I'm not glad my parents had to use their home equity. That part still sits heavy, but I'm glad that I built something honest and that it's still standing. That, in the end, is the whole story.